Rain mingled with mud on the cobblestones the night he threw her away. 5 years ago, Matteo, the Duke of Rothley, condemned the only woman he loved to rot in the northern moors for a forgery she never committed. He thought her broken. He thought her a ghost. But tonight, the ghost wears blood-red silk and owns half the debts in Mayfair. She isn't here for a tearful reunion. She is here to take his world apart piece by piece. Wind battered the cracked window panes of the Crofters' cottage, a relentless howling sound that Eleanor had long ceased to hear. She sat at the scarred wooden table staring at her hands. They did not look like the hands of an earl's daughter. The skin across her knuckles was chapped red, cracked from lye soap and freezing seawater. A dark bruise broomed beneath her left thumbnail, a souvenir from hauling a basket of wet wool 2 days prior. She rubbed her thumb over the rough pad of her index finger. There was no feeling left in the tip. On the table before her lay a thick cream-colored envelope. It smelled faintly of beeswax and London dust, a scent so alien in this damp, peat smoke-filled kitchen that it made her stomach turn. 5 years. She closed her eyes and the memory of the Duke's study rushed her in an uninvited wave of nausea. The suffocating warmth of the roaring fire, the scent of polished leather and Matteo's shaving soap, sharp lime and bitter clove, the heavy wet slap of the forged letters hitting his mahogany desk. "Do not insult me by denying it, Eleanor." Matteo's voice had been devoid of rage, which somehow made it worse. It had been hollow, dead. He had stood by the window, refusing to look at her, the rigid line of his broad shoulders blocking out the gaslight from the street. His sister, Beatrice, had been weeping softly into a lace handkerchief in the corner. The very sister who had forged Eleonora's handwriting, siphoned the Rothley estate funds to pay off her lover's gambling debts, and orchestrated the evidence perfectly. Eleonora had screamed. She had begged. She had dropped to her knees on the Persian rug, the stiff silk of her skirts pooling around her, grasping at Matteo's trousers. He had stepped back, away from her touch. "Leave London tonight," he had said, staring at the empty grate, "or I will see you hang for the embezzlement, title or no." A log snapped in the cottage fireplace, violently pulling Eleonora back to the freezing present. She gasped, her lungs pulling in the sharp, briny air of the Northumberland coast. Her chest ached. It always ached when she remembered the carriage ride away from him, the violent jolting of the wheels, the freezing rain seeping through the carriage roof, the terrifying realization that she had exactly 3 shillings to her name. She looked back down at the envelope. It had arrived 3 hours ago via a mud-splottered courier who looked terrified of her. Eleonora picked up a rusted paring knife and slid it under the wax seal. The thick paper tore with a satisfying fibrous rip. Inside lay a stack of vellum sheets covered in the cramped, spidery handwriting of a Chancery Lane solicitor. Her estranged uncle, a man she had never met, had died in Bengal. He had been a ruthless merchant, an outcast of the family who dealt in spices, silk, and, apparently, extortion. He had left no legitimate heirs, only Eleonora. She read the first page, then the second. The letters began to blur. It wasn't just a fortune. The ledgers detailed a sprawling web of promissory notes, mortgages, and gambling debts. Half of the London ton owed their existence to her late uncle's quiet, predatory loans. Eleanor lowered the paper. The silence in the cottage felt sudden and thick. She didn't smile. She didn't feel a sudden rush of vindictive triumph. Instead, a wave of profound, exhausting grief washed over her. She pressed the heels of her ruined hands against her eyes until bursts of static color exploded in the darkness. Her throat tightened, a dry, painful knot forming as a singular, pathetic thought surfaced. Will Matteo look at me now? She hated herself for it. Hated the physical, animal reaction of her body. The way her pulse still fluttered at the mere thought of his name. She dropped her hands. The firelight caught the harsh lines of her face in the dusty mirror above the wash-basin. She was 26, but the soft, pliable girl who had wept on a duke's rug was dead. Her cheekbones were sharp, hollowed out by winters of rationing oats and salted fish. Her eyes, once a bright nave hazel, looked dull and flat, like dirty coins. Elena stood up. The chair scraped harshly against the stone floor. She walked to the small wooden chest at the foot of her narrow cot and pulled out a tin of grease. She needed to pack. She needed a carriage. But first, she needed to moisturize the cracks in her hands. She couldn't hold a pen to sign the ruin of Mayfair if her fingers bled onto the parchment. London smelled exactly as she remembered, a vile concoction of raw sewage from the Thames, burning coal, and the sickeningly sweet overlay of expensive floral perfumes meant to mask it all. Eleanor sat rigidly in the back of the hired hackney, the springs groaning as the carriage hit a pothole on Park Lane. The jolt sent a sharp pain shooting up her spine. Her corset, newly tailored and stiff with rigid whalebone, bit mercilessly into her ribs. She was suffocating. The air inside the carriage was close and humid, smelling of old leather and damp wool. Outside, the imposing facade of Lord Harrington's townhouse loomed, ablaze with hundreds of wax candles. The street was choked with carriages. Footmen shouted over the clatter of hooves. Eleanor looked down at her lap. Her dress was an obscenity of wealth, deep arterial red silk cut dangerously low at the bodice, devoid of the lace and ruffles currently in fashion. It was a gown designed not to charm, but to sever. She wore no gloves. Her scars were fully exposed. The carriage lurched to a halt. The door swung open, and the damp night air slapped her face. She didn't wait for the footman's hand. She stepped out, her heel catching slightly on the iron step. She stumbled, a sharp spike of adrenaline shooting through her as she threw out a hand to catch the door frame. She breathed heavily, her cheeks flushing hot with sudden embarrassment. Perfect, she thought bitterly. The conquering queen returns, tripping over her own shoes. She smoothed the heavy silk of her skirts, forcing her breathing to slow. The wet pavement soaked instantly into the thin soles of her slippers. She walked toward the grand entrance, each step feeling like moving through deep water. The heat hit her the moment she surrendered her velvet cloak to the butler. The ballroom was a chaotic crush of sweating bodies, rustling satin, and the frantic soaring sounds of a string quartet trying to be heard over the deafening roar of conversation. It was claustrophobic. The air tasted of sour wine, face powder, and bad breath. Eleanor stood at the top of the marble stairs. Nobody noticed her at first. She was just another body in the throng. She needed a drink. Her mouth was entirely devoid of moisture, tasting like copper and old dust. She descended the stairs, her movements stiff. A passing waiter nearly collided with her, and she snatched a glass of champagne from his silver tray with a muttered, clumsy apology. The crystal was sticky. She took a sip. It was warm and overly sweet, coating the back of her throat in a cloying film. She moved toward the edge of the room, pressing her back against a cool plaster pillar. She watched them. There was Lady Cowper, laughing too loudly, completely unaware that Eleanor held the mortgage to her country estate in a leather folio back at the hotel. There was Lord Fife, sweating profusely through his cravat. His gambling debts now belonging exclusively to the woman he had once publicly called a grasping little perverse, ugly satisfaction twisted in her gut, immediately followed by a wave of intense loneliness. She was surrounded by 300 people, yet the isolation was absolute. She rubbed her thumb against the side of her glass, feeling the thick, raised scar tissue catch on the smooth crystal. "I say," a reedy voice broke her concentration. Eleanor turned. A young viscount, barely out of his teens and flushed with too much claret, was peering at her collarbone. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I would certainly remember a dress like that." He gave a wet, sloppy smile. Elena stared at him. She felt the sudden, violent urge to push him backward into the passing crowd. Instead, she took another sip of the terrible champagne. "Walk away," she said. Her voice was lower than it used to be, rasped by years of breathing sea mist. The boy blinked, his smile faltering. "I beg your pardon." "Walk away," she repeated, not raising her voice, her dead eyes fixing on his flushed face. "Before I find out who your father is and buy the ground you're standing on." The Viscount's mouth opened, then closed. He took a hasty step back, bumping into a dowager, and disappeared into the throng. Elena let out a shaky breath. Her hands were trembling slightly. The encounter had drained her, stripping away the thin veneer of cold control she had spent weeks practicing in the mirror. She closed her eyes, resting the back of her head against the pillow. The noise of the ballroom washed over her, a meaningless static. Then, the scent of the crowd shifted. Through the overwhelming stench of rosewater, sweat, and stale wine, a single, agonizingly familiar note cut through the air. Sharp lime, bitter clove, clean wool. Elena's eyes snapped open. Her stomach plummeted violently, as if the floor had simply given way beneath her feet. He was standing less than 20 feet away. Matteo. Elena's lungs locked. The air simply refused to enter her body. The heavy crystal glass in her hand felt suddenly slick, slipping dangerously against her scarred fingers. She gripped it until her knuckles turned bone white. He looked older. That was her first, stupidly mundane thought. The harsh gaslight from the chandelier above caught the heavy streaks of silver at his temples, stark against his dark hair. The broad shoulders that had once been her entire world were rigid beneath a perfectly tailored black evening coat. There were deep, exhausted lines carved around his mouth. He was not smiling. He stood beside a potted fern, staring blankly out at the dancing couples, looking utterly detached from the flesh and noise around him. For 5 years, Elena had rehearsed this moment. While scrubbing stone floors, she had imagined laughing in his face. While shivering under thin blankets, she had imagined striking him across the jaw. She had imagined feeling like an avenging god. Instead, a pathetic, treacherous whimper built in the back of her throat. Her body remembered him. Her skin prickled beneath the heavy silk. A phantom warmth bloomed low in her belly, a vile betrayal of her own biology. She wanted to run. She wanted to turn, push her way through the sweating crowd, throw herself back into the damp hackney, and flee back to the freezing isolation of the coast. Coward, a voice hissed in her head. Look your hands. She shifted her weight. The silk of her dress rustled, a heavy scraping sound. Matteo's head turned. The movement was casual at first. His gaze swept over the crowd, bored and heavy. Then, his eyes snagged on the shock of blood-red silk. His gaze traveled up the bodice, up the pale column of her neck, and locked onto her face. Elena stopped breathing entirely. The roaring noise of the ballroom faded into a dull underwater hum. All she could hear was the frantic, sickening thud of her own pulse echoing in her ears. Matteo's entire body went perfectly, unnaturally still. The color drained from his face with terrifying speed, leaving him a waxy, ashen gray. His mouth parted slightly. For a second, he looked exactly like a man who had just been shot in the chest and had not yet felt the pain. He took a step forward, then another. He was moving mechanically, shoving blindly past a protesting duchess, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet felt nailed to the marble floor. He stopped 3 feet away. The scent of him, lime, cloves, the faint metallic tang of cold night air, hit her like a physical blow. It took every ounce of her willpower not to close her eyes and breathe it in. Elena, he whispered. The words sounded torn out of him, raw and bleeding. Up close, the damage was undeniable. His eyes, usually a sharp, intelligent grey, were bloodshot and circled with dark, bruised flesh. A muscle in his jaw jumped erratically. He reached out a hand toward her, his fingers trembling in the space between them. Don't, she said. The word came out harsher, uglier than she intended. It was a croak, defensive and panicked. Matteo's hand dropped. He looked at her as if she were a mirage about to dissipate. You died, he choked out, his voice cracking on the final syllable. The magistrate in Northumberland, he sent word 3 years ago. The winter fever, he sent a death certificate. Elena felt a cold, dark satisfaction finally break through the panic. She swallowed hard, forcing her throat to work. I did die, Your Grace, she said, her voice flattening into a dull, emotionless drone. The girl you threw into the street died of cold and malnutrition in a crofter's hut. I dug the grave myself. Matteo flinched violently, stepping back as if she had struck him. Jen, please, do not call me that. She shifted her grip on her glass. The warmth of her hand had made the champagne tepid. "My name is Miss Elena Hayes. Though according to the ledgers I purchased this morning from the Bank of England." She tilted her head, watching the misery pool in his eyes with a detachment she didn't entirely feel. "I believe you may simply address me as your primary creditor." Matteo didn't look at the dress. He didn't look at her face. Slowly, inevitably, his eyes dropped to her hands. She hadn't hidden them. She stood with her arms relaxed at her sides. He stared at the split cuticles, the thick, ugly yellow calluses, the dark, bruised nail. The physical evidence of his decree. A sharp, ragged breath tore through his lips. It sounded remarkably like a sob. He closed his eyes, his chest heaving under the pristine white cravat. "What have I done?" he whispered to the floor. "Exactly what was required of you," Elena replied. Her fingernails dug into her own palms, the sharp pain grounding her, keeping the tears that burned behind her eyes firmly at bay. "Now, if you will excuse me. I find the smell in this corner terribly offensive." She didn't wait for him to move. She stepped around him, her shoulder brushing roughly against his coat. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine, making her teeth ache. She walked away, keeping her spine rigid, leaving him standing alone by the fern, a shattered man in a room full of noise. By the time she reached the terrace doors, a single hot tear finally escaped, cutting a stinging path down her powdered cheek. She wiped it away furiously with a scarred knuckle. This wasn't victory. It tasted exactly like ashes. Morning broke over London like a swelling bruise, painting the sky in sickly shades of purple and grey smog. Elena had not slept. She sat in a winged armchair near the window of her suite at the Savoy, a heavy woolen blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders. The bed behind her remained perfectly made. The mattress had been too soft. After years of sleeping on a mattress stuffed with dried heather and horsehair, the feather down felt suffocating, like sinking into a swamp. She had spent the night curled on the hard Axminster rug near the hearth, staring at the dying embers until they turned to grey powder. Now, the brass clock on the mantel ticked with an infuriating rhythmic chirp. 7:00. Her hands rested on her lap, holding a porcelain teacup. The tea had gone cold an hour ago. A thin, iridescent film of oils floated on its dark surface. She stared at it, her mind endlessly replaying the sickening lurch of her stomach when Matteo had spoken her name, Elena. His voice had been a physical weight in the ballroom, pressing the air from her lungs. She hated that her pulse had quickened. She hated the phantom heat that had bloomed on her neck where his breath had brushed her skin. She set the teacup down on the mahogany side table. The porcelain clinked sharply against the wood. Work, she told herself. Focus on the ledger. She moved to the writing desk and opened the heavy, leather-bound book her late uncle's solicitor had provided. The pages smelled of binding glue and old dust. She ran her calloused index finger down the list of names, the thick raised scar tissue scraping softly against the heavy vellum paper. She stopped at a name halfway down the second page, Lord Thomas Ashdown. Outstanding debt, £14,000 secured against the Ashdown estate, Sussex, and the London townhouse on Grosvenor Square. Lord Thomas Ashdown, the man who had married Lady Beatrice roughly 3 years ago. The man who was currently funding his lavish stable of racing horses with borrowed coin, entirely unaware that the promissory notes had just transferred into the hands of a ghost. A sharp, humorless exhale escaped Elena's lips. It wasn't quite a laugh. Beatrice had forged those letters to save her previous lover from a debtor's prison, framing Elena to keep the scandal from Matteo. And yet, here Beatrice was married to a man neck-deep in identical ruin. The irony tasted metallic on her tongue. A knock sounded at the suite door, firm, polite, deferential. "Enter." I called out, her voice raspy from disuse. Mr. Hughes, her hired secretary, stepped into the room. He was a small, nervous man whose collar always seemed half an inch too tight. He carried a silver tray holding a stack of morning correspondence. He carefully avoided looking at her hands. "A visitor, Miss Hayes," Hughes said, his voice dropping an octave, as if imparting a terrible secret. "A lady." She is waiting in the private parlor downstairs. She insists it is a matter of absolute urgency. Who is it? Lady Ashdown, madam. Elena went perfectly still. The sounds of the street below, the clatter of iron-shod hooves, the shouts of fishmongers seemed to mute. Beatrice, here, at 7 in the morning. She must have been informed by her husband's bankers at the break of dawn that their debts had been sold. Panic had driven her from her bed. Keep her waiting for exactly 20 minutes. Elena instructed, her tone painfully level. Serve her nothing. Do not offer to take her coat. Then, bring her up. Yes, Miss Hayes. Hughes bowed and slipped out, closing the door with a soft click. Elena walked to the mirror above the dressing table. She looked haggard. The skin beneath her eyes was bruised with exhaustion, her pale complexion washed out by the gloomy morning light. She did not reach for the rouge pot. She wanted Beatrice to see the damage. She wanted the Duchess's pampered sister to look at the walking corpse she had created. She unpinned her hair, letting the heavy dark mass fall around her shoulders, then tied it back with a simple black ribbon. Severe, unforgiving. She changed from a dressing gown into a high-collared day dress of stiff black bombazine. It felt like armor. 20 minutes later, the door opened again. Beatrice rushed in before Hughes could announce her. She looked frantic. Her blonde hair, usually coiffed into perfect ringlets, was shoved hastily under a velvet walking hat. She smelled overwhelmingly of sweet jasmine and sour panic. Her blue silk pelisse was improperly buttoned. I demand to speak with whoever is in charge of the Beatrice began, her high, reedy voice filling the room. She stopped abruptly. Elena stood by the window, the grey light silhouetting her rigid posture. She didn't move. She let the silence stretch, thick and suffocating, allowing Beatrice's eyes to adjust to the dim light of the suite. Beatrice's mouth fell open. The colour drained from her perfectly powdered cheeks, leaving 2 stark, artificial circles of rouge behind. She stumbled backward, the heel of her boot catching in the hem of her skirt. Her gloved hands flew to her throat. "You," Beatrice whispered, the word escaping as a wet, ragged hiss. "No, no," Matteo said. Matteo received the papers from the magistrate. Magistrates are remarkably easy to bribe. Beatrice, when one has nothing left to lose, Elena said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the screaming rage she had practiced in the damp, cold of the northern moors. She stepped away from the window. A grave was dug. A body was buried. It simply wasn't mine. There was a cholera outbreak in the village. An orphan girl took my place in the earth, and I took her anonymity. Beatrice pressed her back against the heavy mahogany door, her chest heaving rapidly. She looked at Elena as if staring at a demon summoned from the floorboards. "What do you want?" £14,000, Elena replied smoothly. She walked to the desk and tapped the open ledger. "Due by the end of the month, as per the original terms of your husband's agreement with my late uncle, or I will seize Grosvenor Square, sell the racehorses to a glue factory, and have Lord Ashdown thrown into the Fleet. We don't have it." Beatrice shrieked, the veneer of aristocratic poise entirely shattering. "You know we don't have it. Thomas has lost everything at the tables." She took a desperate step forward, tears spilling over her lashes. "Eleanor, please. I know there is bad blood between us. Bad blood." Eleanor repeated the phrase slowly, testing the absurd inadequacy of the words. She looked down at her hands. She held them up, palms facing Beatrice. The morning light caught the jagged white scars crossing her palms, the thickened joints, the permanently discoloured nail. Beatrice recoiled, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle a gag. "This is not bad blood, Beatrice. This is 5 years of hauling freezing water from a communal well so I wouldn't die of thirst. This is scrubbing the wool and grease from unwashed sheep fleeces until my fingernails separated from the beds." Eleanor dropped her hands. Her tone remained chillingly conversational. "You forged those letters to Matteo. You stole from your own brother's estate, and you handed him the pen to sign my death warrant. I was desperate." Beatrice sobbed, sinking slightly at the knees, her silk skirts pooling around her on the carpet. Geoffrey was going to shoot himself if he couldn't pay his debts. I loved him. And Matteo loved me, Elena said. The words tasted like ash, but he believed you. He believed the sister who wept on his rug. She walked toward Beatrice, her black bombazine dress rustling like dry leaves. She stopped inches from the weeping woman. The smell of jasmine was nauseating close. I am calling the debt, Beatrice. I want the house. I want the horses. I want you to feel the cold pavement under your bare feet. Eleanor leaned in, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. Tell your husband to pack. Rain lashed against the parlor window of the Savoy suite, a violent driving downpour that rattled the glass in its wooden casing. The sky had darkened to the color of wet slate, forcing Eleanor to light the gas lamps early in the afternoon. She was sitting on the floor by the fire, methodically sorting through a stack of promissory notes, when the heavy oak door shuddered under 3 loud, frantic knocks. It wasn't Hughes. Her secretary knew better than to pound on the wood like a drunkard at a tavern door. Eleanor stiffened. A cold prickle of anticipation dragged down her spine. She carefully set the papers on the rug, wiped a smudge of ink from her thumb, and stood up. Her knees ached in the damp weather, a lingering gift from the stone floors of Northumberland. She walked to the door and pulled the brass handle. Matteo stood in the hallway. He was soaked to the bone. He wore no hat, and his dark, silver-streaked hair was plastered to his skull, dripping rainwater onto the expensive carpet of the corridor. His heavy wool greatcoat was black with moisture, smelling strongly of wet sheep and city grime. He was breathing heavily, his broad chest rising and falling in sharp, erratic jerks. He looked like a man who had run for miles, completely abandoning the rigid dignity of a duke. Eleanor stared at him, her hand gripping the doorframe so tightly the wood bit into her palm. She felt an immediate, humiliating rush of adrenaline. Beatrice came to see me, Matteo said. His voice was a raw, scraping sound, entirely stripped of its usual deep, resonant authority. I assume she ran to you weeping. Elena replied, her face a mask of freezing indifference. She did not step aside to let him in. Did she ask you to pay her husband's debts, Your Grace? Matteo flinched at the title. He raised a hand, slick with rain, and pressed the heel of his palm against his forehead. She told me she confessed. The words hung in the narrow space between them, heavier than the damp air. Elena's stomach dropped into a bottomless gorge. She had imagined this moment. She had dreamed of it while huddled under a thin, moth-eaten blanket, listening to the ocean wind. She had thought hearing those words would feel like victory. She had thought it would feel like watching a mountain crumble. Instead, she felt nothing but a profound, exhausting emptiness. I seed. Her voice was terribly small. She cleared her throat, forcing volume back into it. Well, then you know. Elena, please. Matteo stepped forward, crossing the threshold before she could block him. He didn't care about the mud he was tracking onto the pristine rugs. He reached out, his wet hands gripping her upper arms. The damp cold of his coat immediately seeped through the thin silk of her sleeves. She gasped, her body betraying her with a violent, involuntary shudder. She tried to pull back, but his grip was iron, not bruising, but desperate. Let go of me, she hissed, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. I sent you away. Matteo wasn't looking at her face. He was staring at her shoulder, his chest heaving. Rainwater that from his jaw, landing on the collar of her dress. I looked at the woman I was going to marry, and I called her a thief. I threatened to hang you. My God, Eleanor, what have I done to you? You did what was easy, Matteo. She finally snapped, the dam breaking. She shoved her hands against his chest, her scarred palms meeting the sodden wool of his coat. She pushed with all her strength, forcing him to stumble back a step. You looked at the evidence Beatrice handed you, and you didn't even hesitate. You didn't investigate. You didn't ask questions. You just wanted the mess gone, so the Rothley name wouldn't be tarnished in the papers. I was blind, he choked out, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were bloodshot, swimming with a devastation so absolute it made Eleanor's chest physically ache. I was a terrified, arrogant fool. I thought I was protecting the estate. I thought he broke off. a ragged sound escaping his throat. "I thought you were dead. For 3 years I have walked through my life completely hollowed out, believing I killed you." "You did kill me," she said bitterly, wrapping her arms around her own waist, suddenly feeling freezing cold. "The girl you proposed to is dead. She died the first winter when she had to choose between buying coal or buying bread. She died when the magistrate tried to force himself into her croft, and she had to break his jaw with an iron skillet to survive." Matteo physically recoiled, his face turning an ashen, sickly grey. He covered his mouth with his hand, turning away from her as if he were going to be violently ill. He staggered toward the fireplace, gripping the mantel with white-knuckled intensity. The ticking of the brass clock seemed deafening in the silence that followed. "I will give you everything," Matteo whispered to the flames, his back to her. "The estate, the accounts, my life. You can have it all. Just tell me how to fix this." Elena watched the rigid line of his shoulders shake. A twisted, miserable knot tightened in her throat. This was the vengeance she had craved. The great Duke of Rothley, broken and weeping in her parlour. She walked slowly toward him. The rustle of her skirts was the only sound in the room besides the driving rain outside. She stopped just behind him. She could smell the faint trace of lime and clove beneath the overpowering stench of wet wool. She raised her right hand and gently, deliberately laid it against the back of his neck. He froze, breath caught audibly. She dragged her thumb across his skin. The thick, colored ridges of her scars rasped harshly against his soft, aristocratic flesh. It was an ugly, abrasive touch. "You can't fix this, Matteo," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the crackling fire. "You can't buy back the skin on my hands. You can't unfreeze my bones." She let her hand drop away from his neck, stepping back into the cold room. "But you can start by paying Lady Ashdown's debts, because by Friday I am taking her house." Friday smelled of damp plaster and packing twine. Grosvenor Square was usually insulated from the crude realities of commerce, wrapped in a serene bubble of old money and manicured hedges. This morning, however, the heavy mahogany doors of the Ashdown townhouse were propped wide open, exposing the opulent, frantic guts of the estate to the grey London streets. Elena stood on the pavement, the toes of her practical leather boots resting inches from a puddle of muddy rainwater. She wore a charcoal wool travelling suit, severe and entirely unadorned. Beside her, Mr. Hughes held a thick clipboard, his pen scratching furiously against the paper as two burly, sweating bailiffs hauled a gilded Louis the XV console table down the front steps. The table bumped hard against the stone banister. A sharp, loud crack echoed across the square as a piece of the delicate gold leaf trim splintered and fell to the ground. From inside the cavernous hallway, a shrill scream pierced the damp air. "Careful, you clumsy brute." "That belonged to my mother." Beatrice appeared in the doorway, her hair a frantic, unpinned halo around her pale face. She wore a silk dressing gown, having flatly refused to dress for the eviction. Her eyes were swollen, red-rimmed, and leaking steady streams of tears that cut through her hastily applied face powder. Behind her stood Lord Thomas Ashdown. He looked decidedly green. His usually puffed-out chest had collapsed, and he was sweating profusely into his wilted morning cravat, clutching a half-empty crystal decanter of brandy. "Miss Hayes, I demand you halt this at once." Thomas blustered, staggering slightly as he stepped onto the portico. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Eleanor. "My banker is meeting with the Duke of Rothley this very hour. Matteo will settle this ridiculous sum. You are making a public spectacle for nothing." Eleanor didn't blink. She watched a bailiff carry out a stack of velvet dining chairs, the rich fabric looking obscenely vibrant under the gloomy sky. "Mr. Hughes," she said, her voice carrying a flat, metallic edge. "Ensure they take the Persian rugs from the drawing room. Leave the floorboards bare." "You vindictive bitch," Beatrice sobbed, launching herself forward. She grabbed the iron railing, her knuckles turning white. "He is my brother. He will not let you throw me into the street." The rhythmic clatter of approaching hooves cut through Beatrice's hysteria. A sleek black carriage turned into the square, pulled by four matched greys. The Rothley crest was emblazoned on the door in subtle dark gold. It rolled to a smooth halt directly behind the hired wagons of the bailiffs. Beatrice gasped, a wet hiccuping sound of profound relief. "Matteo." "Thomas, look. It is Matteo. He brought the draft." Elena's jaw locked. The muscles in her neck tightened so painfully, she felt a dull ache throb behind her temples. She turned her head, bracing herself for the inevitable. She knew exactly how this played out. Blood always protected blood. Matteo would step from the carriage, hand her a perfectly crisp piece of paper from the Bank of England, and the Ashdowns would retreat into their gilded cage, bruised but entirely safe. The carriage door opened. Matteo stepped down onto the wet cobblestones. He was dressed immaculately in a dark morning coat, but the rigid perfection of his clothing only highlighted the ruin of his face. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened into bruised hollows. He looked as though he hadn't slept since he left her parlor. "Matteo," Beatrice cried, hiking up her silk skirts and running down the stone steps. She threw arms around his neck, burying her face in his wool lapel. "Tell them to stop. She is taking everything. The horses, the silver. Make her stop." Matteo stood perfectly still. He did not wrap his arms around his sister. He didn't even look at her. His hollow, grey eyes were fixed entirely on Elena. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and peeled Beatrice's hands off his shoulders. "Matteo," Beatrice whispered, stepping back, her brow furrowing in confusion. "The bailiffs will continue their work," Matteo said. His voice was a rasp of dry gravel, loud enough to echo across the street. Several passing pedestrians stopped, their umbrellas dipping as they turned to stare. Thomas nearly dropped his brandy decanter. "See here, Rothley. You cannot mean to let this extortionist ruin us." Matteo finally pulled his gaze from Elena and looked at his brother-in-law. The disgust in his eyes was so absolute, so terrifyingly cold, that Thomas visibly shrank back. "You borrowed money you did not have to fund a lifestyle you did not earn," Matteo said softly. Then he turned to his sister. Beatrice was trembling violently, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "And you, Beatrice, you forged documents. You stole from our family, and you sacrificed an innocent woman's life to hide your husband's pathetic failures." "I am your sister," Beatrice shrieked, the sound tearing at the heavy, damp air. "You are a thief," Matteo corrected, his tone devoid of any familial warmth. It was the exact, dead voice he had used in his study 5 years ago. "And today you pay your debt. I will not give you a single shilling." He turned his back on them and walked toward Elena. Beatrice collapsed onto the bottom step, wailing into her hands, while Thomas stared blankly at the bailiffs carrying his prized collection of hunting rifles out the door. Matteo stopped a foot away from Elena. The smell of his shaving soap, lime and clove, was sharper today, cutting through the scent of wet dust and horse manure. He looked down at her. He didn't look proud of what he had just done. He looked hollowed out, waiting for the executioner's blade. "Is it done?" he asked quietly. Elena stared at his chest, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing. She had thought watching him abandon Beatrice would feel like drinking cold, clear water after years in a desert. She had thought it would fill the gaping hole in her chest. Instead, it felt like chewing glass. "It's done. Njit, clears throat Njit. She whispered, her voice rough. She looked down at her ruined, scarred hands, shoving them deeply into the pockets of her wool coat so he couldn't see them tremble. "They have until noon to vacate. Then I'm locking the doors." She turned on her heel and walked away, the mud splashing against the hem of her skirt, leaving him standing alone in the street amidst the wreckage of his family. Silence in the Savoy suite was rarely peaceful. Tonight, it felt actively hostile. Eleanor sat at the small dining table, staring at a plate of cold, roasted pheasant. It was a masterpiece of culinary art, swimming in a rich plum reduction. Beside it sat a crystal goblet of expensive Bordeaux. She hadn't touched either. Instead, she held a hard, stale crust of rye bread she had instructed the kitchen staff to fetch from the servants' quarters. She chewed it slowly, the rough texture scraping comfortably against the roof of her mouth. The pheasant terrified her. Her stomach, shrunk and hardened by years of surviving on salted cord and oat gruel, violently rejected rich food. 3 nights ago, she had tried a single bite of buttered lobster and spent the next hour retching into a porcelain basin. The grand clock in the corner ticked toward midnight. The ledgers were closed. Beatrice was sleeping in a cheap rented room in Cheapside. Thomas Ashdown was sitting in a debtor's cell at the Fleet Prison waiting for a magistrate. Eleanor had won. She swallowed the dry bread, feeling it catch painfully in her throat. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. The skin felt paper-thin and hot. Why was she so furious? The rage that had sustained her through 5 freezing winters was dissipating, and underneath it there was nothing but a sprawling, terrifying exhaustion. A sharp, singular knock sounded at the door. Eleanor dropped her hands. Hughes had gone home hours ago. She stood up, her muscles screaming in protest, and walked to the door, pulling it open. Matteo stood in the dimly lit corridor. He wasn't wearing an evening coat, just a rumpled white linen shirt open at the collar and dark trousers. He held a heavy iron lockbox under his left arm. He didn't ask for permission to enter. He simply walked past her, bringing the smell of night air and stale whiskey into the room. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor demanded, slamming the door shut with more force than necessary. The brass hinges rattled. Matteo set the heavy iron box down on the mahogany writing desk. It landed with a dull final thud that vibrated through the floorboards. He pulled a small iron key from his pocket, unlocked the latch, and flipped the heavy lid open. "These are the deeds to the Rothley estate in Yorkshire," Matteo said, his voice flat, exhausted. He pulled out a thick stack of vellum documents bound in red ribbon and dropped them on the desk. "This is the deed to the London townhouse. These are the bank drafts containing the entirety of my liquid capital at the Bank of England." Eleanor froze, the stale crust bread suddenly sitting like a stone in her stomach. "What is this?" "This is your pound of flesh," Matteo said. He turned to face her. The whiskey she had smelled wasn't just on his clothes. It was on his breath, though his eyes were painfully sober. "You took my sister's life today. I didn't stop you because she deserved it. I deserved worse, so I am giving it to you." He took a step toward her, his jaw set in a rigid line of self-loathing. "Take the houses, take the land, take the titles. Ruin me, Eleanor, put me in the street." His voice cracked, dropping to a harsh whisper. "Please. I cannot bear walking around in the skin of a man who did this to you. Just take it all and let me be done with it." A violent, blinding fury erupted in Eleanor's chest. It was sudden and entirely uncontrollable. She lunged forward, grabbing the crystal goblet of Bordeaux from the table. She didn't throw it at him. She threw it fiercely at the brick fireplace. The crystal shattered with a deafening crash, showering the hearth in jagged shards, the dark red wine splattering across the white marble like an arterial spray. Matteo didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "You arrogant, pathetic coward," Eleanor screamed. Her voice tore at her throat, ragged and raw, shaking the walls of the suite. Her chest heaved, the stiff bombazine of her bodice suddenly too tight to breathe. "You think this makes it right? You think throwing your gold at my feet washes the blood off your hands?" She closed the distance between them, jabbing a thick, scarred finger hard against his chest. "I don't want your houses. I don't want your money." She yelled, tears of absolute frustration finally spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "I wanted my life back. I wanted the warmth in my fingers back. I wanted the girl who loved you back, and she is dead. Your deeds cannot resurrect her." Matteo let out a shuddering breath. He looked down at the scarred finger pressing into his chest. Then, slowly, he raised his own hand and covered hers. His palm was warm. Her skin was freezing. Eleanor tried to yank her hand away, but he held it tight, pressing her ruined palm flat against his heartbeat. It was hammering against his ribs, frantic and erratic. "I know," he whispered. His eyes filled with tears, spilling over his dark lashes and tracking through the exhaustion on his face. I know she is dead. I killed her, and I am not asking the woman standing in front of me for forgiveness. I am asking her for my punishment. He dropped to his knees. The movement was so sudden, so utterly devoid of a duke's pride, that Eleanor stumbled back. Matteo knelt on the thick Persian rug, his head bowed, his hands resting on his thighs. He was surrendering. Not just his wealth, but his dignity, his title, his entire existence, placing it entirely at the mercy of a ghost he had created. Eleanor looked down at him. The silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ragged sound of his breathing. She looked at the iron lockbox. She looked at the shattered crystal and the wine dripping down the marble like blood. She slowly lowered herself, sinking down until she was kneeling on the floor opposite him. The stiff fabric of her dress pooled around him, creating a dark island on the rug. She reached out. Her hand trembled violently. She didn't strike him. She didn't scream. She pressed her scarred, broken fingers against the wet skin of his cheek. Matteo closed his eyes, leaning into her touch with a desperate, broken sigh as the sheer weight of 5 missing years finally collapsed on top of them both. The hearth fire popped, sending a spray of orange sparks against the blackened iron grate. Matteo remained on his knees. His breath shuddered against her palm, hot and damp. Elena let her hand linger for 3 seconds. She counted them. 1, 2, 3. She felt the harsh prickle of his morning shadow against her thumb, the wet sliding track of a tear across her calluses, the frantic jumping pulse at his jaw. It was repulsive. It was intoxicating. It was completely unbearable. She dropped her hand as if his skin had scalded her. The sudden loss of contact left the cold air to rush in, stinging her knuckles. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany desk and hauled herself up. Her knees, permanently damaged from years of kneeling on damp flagstones, popped with a sharp, ugly crack that echoed in the quiet room. Matteo flinched at the sound, his eyes opening. He looked up at her from the floor. He didn't look like a duke. He looked like a beggar waiting for a kick to the ribs. "Get up," Elena rasped. She turned her back to him, unable to look at the absolute devastation in his grey eyes for 1 second longer. She stared instead at the puddle of spilled Bordeaux seeping into the white marble of the fireplace. The smell of it was turning sour, a sickly, fermented sweetness masking the wood smoke. She heard the heavy rustle of wool and the scrape of his leather boots against the rug as he slowly stood. He swayed slightly, his large frame casting a long, wavering shadow across the wallpaper. "Elena, I said I don't want your money, Matteo." She cut him off, her voice dropping into a flat, dangerous monotone. She walked back to the desk and slammed the heavy iron lid of the lockbox shut. The metallic clang made him flinch again. "Do you think poverty is a cleansing ritual? Do you truly believe that starving in the streets will magically balance the scales? That if you suffer, my scars will fade? I don't know how else to pay you," he whispered, his voice completely usual deep resonance. "I cannot undo the past. I cannot give you back the years. No, you can't." She turned around. The adrenaline was leaving her system, replaced by a crushing, leaden exhaustion that settled in the marrow of her bones. "Poverty isn't noble, Matteo. It isn't a romantic tragedy. It is ugly and it is boring, and it makes you cruel. It makes you willing to cave a man's skull in for a sack of rotting potatoes." She picked up the iron lockbox and shoved it roughly against his chest. He caught it instinctively, his arms wrapping around the heavy metal. "Keep your estate," she said, her dead eyes locking onto his. "Keep your title. Keep your useless, enormous houses. I already own half of Mayfair. I don't need the headache of managing your Yorkshire tenants." Matteo stared down at the box in his arms, his brow furrowing in agonizing confusion. "Then what do you want from me?" "I want you to live with it," she said simply. The words hung in the air, heavier than the iron box. "I want you to wake up every morning in your silk sheets, and I want you to remember the mud. I want you to sit in the House of Lords, passing judgment on thieves and liars, and remember that you are no better than any of them. Elena stepped closer, the stiff bombazine of her skirt brushing against his trousers. You want to run away, Matteo. Handing me this box is cowardice. It is you trying to escape the guilt. His jaw clenched. A muscle ticked furiously beneath his skin. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. I don't want you ruined, Elena continued, the fury completely drained from her, leaving only a brutal, unvarnished honesty. I want you to stand beside me when I strip this rotten aristocracy down to its bones, when I collect every debt from every hypocrite who smiled at me while bankrupting their estates. I want the great Duke of Rothley standing at my right hand, endorsing every single ruin. Matteo's breath caught. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing past the blood-red silk and the black bombazine, past the vengeance, straight into the terrifying, magnificent creature she had become. You want me to be your weapon? He said softly. You handed the pen to Beatrice to forge my death warrant, she replied, her scarred hands gripping the edge of the desk. Now, you are going to hold the inkwell while I rewrite the ton. A long suffocating silence stretched between them. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault against the glass, blurring the gaslights of the London street into smears of yellow. Slowly, Matteo lowered the iron box. He placed it carefully on the floor beside his feet. He didn't nod. He didn't offer a dramatic vow of fealty. He simply looked at her ruined hands, then up to her exhausted, hollowed eyes, and stepped forward. Then I am yours, he said. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by a quiet, ironclad certainty. Whatever you break, I will hold the pieces. Eleanor looked away, staring into the dying embers of the fire. A painful, tight spasm gripped her chest. Something dangerously close to relief. It wasn't forgiveness. It would never be a clean slate, but it was a foundation, and it was built entirely of stone. 6 months later, the study in Rothley House smelled exactly as Eleanor remembered. Sharp lime, bitter clove, and polished leather. She sat in the high-backed mahogany chair behind the massive oak desk. It was Matteo's chair, tailored for a man 6 inches taller and 100 lb heavier. She looked small in it, swallowed by the dark green velvet, but she did not look diminished. She wore a gown of dark forest green velvet, the sleeves trimmed with simple black lace. She wore no gloves. She never wore gloves anymore. On the desk before her lay the master ledger. It was open to the final page of the current quarter. Beside it sat a crystal tumbler containing 2 fingers of amber whiskey and a silver tray holding a stack of freshly signed property deeds. Lady Cowper's country estate acquired. Lord Five's gambling markers collected. The Ashdown debts fully liquidated, with Thomas Ashdown currently sweeping floors in a debtor's ward, while Beatrice lived on a meagre, strict allowance Eleanor dictated monthly. The door to the study clicked open. Eleanor didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the columns of numbers, her calloused finger tracing the line of ink. The heavy, measured tread of leather boots crossed the thick Persian rug, the same rug where she had once begged for her life. Matteo stopped beside the desk. He carried a silver letter opener and a stack of morning correspondence. He looked different than he had 6 months ago. The bruised exhaustion had faded from his eyes, replaced by a calm, steady alertness. The silver at his temples seemed brighter, less like a symptom of stress and more like a mark of permanence. He was dressed impeccably as always, but the rigid, untouchable arrogance of the Duke was gone. He moved with the quiet, deliberate caution of a man carrying a live explosive. The final transfer from the Earl of Stanhope cleared this morning, Matteo said, placing a heavy parchment envelope on the desk. He sold his racing stud to cover the outstanding interest. He requested a personal meeting to discuss a payment plan for the principal. Deny it, Elena said flatly, finally looking up. She reached for the whiskey tumbler. Tell his solicitors he has exactly 30 days to liquidate the London townhouse, or we seize the ships in Bristol. His wife is with child, Matteo noted gently. It wasn't a protest, merely a presentation of a fact. Elena took a slow sip of the whiskey. It burned a hot, satisfying path down her throat. She set the glass down, the crystal clinking softly against the wood. And my mother was dead by the time I was born. Poverty is an excellent midwife, Matteo. It builds character. Deny the meeting. Matteo nodded once. I will send the courier immediately. He didn't argue. He never argued. For 6 months the Duke of Rothley had acted as her quiet, terrifying enforcer. His presence at her side at every ball, every theatre box, every bank meeting had sent a shockwave of absolute terror through the ton. No one dared question Miss Alina Hayes when the most powerful peer in England stood behind her chair, a silent, imposing shadow validate her every ruthless maneuver. Matteo turned to leave, but paused. He looked at the open ledger, then down at her hands resting on the paper. The scars were no longer angry red. They had faded to a stark, silvery white against her pale skin. The bruised nail had fallen off and grown back, thick and slightly ridged. They were not beautiful hands, but they were strong. Slowly, Matteo reached out. Alina went perfectly still. She didn't pull away as his large, immaculate hand covered hers. His skin was warm. It was always so terribly warm. He didn't hold her hand like a delicate flower. He gripped it firmly, his thumb dragging slowly across the thick, raised scar tissue on her knuckles. It was a quiet, private ritual between them. An acknowledgement. "Are you tired, Alina?" he asked softly, the low rumble of his voice vibrating in the quiet room. She looked at his hand covering hers. The stark contrast between his pristine, aristocratic skin and her ruined flesh was a visual representation of their entire existence. Yes, she admitted, the word slipping out before she could stop it. The truth was, she was exhausted. The vengeance, the numbers, the endless parade of terrified, pleading aristocrats. It had filled the hole in her chest with gold, but gold was heavy. Matteo squeezed her fingers, then closed the book for today. He'd tell her to stop. He didn't ask her to forgive the debts or soften her grip on the throat of Mayfair. He just offered her a moment to breathe. Alina looked up into his grey eyes. There was no pity there. Pity had been burned away months ago. There was only a dark, twisted, unyielding devotion. He was a man who had broken his own world to appease the monster he had created, and found he preferred the monster to the world. With her free hand, Alina reached out and gently closed the heavy leather cover of the ledger. It shut with a dull, satisfying thud. She stood up. The dark green velvet of her skirts brushed against his trousers as she stepped around the massive oak desk. She didn't step back to preserve propriety. She stepped directly into his space, the sharp scent of lime and clove enveloping her. Matteo's breath hitched, his chest rising as she looked up at him. "I am closing the book for today," Elena whispered, her voice rough, her chin tilting up. "But tomorrow we take the rest of it." A slow, devastating ghost of a smile finally touched Matteo's lips, reaching the corners of his eyes for the first time in 5 years. He raised a hand, his fingers gently tracing the sharp line of her cheekbone. "Every last piece, my dark queen," he murmured. He leaned down, and as his mouth finally met hers, tasting of bitter remorse, absolute ruin, and the terrifying promise of tomorrow, Elena closed her eyes, knowing the girl in the damp croft was finally, truly dead. And the woman standing in her place was exactly where she belonged. What a journey! If Elena's ruthless rise from the ashes and Matteo's heavy penance kept you hooked until the very end, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Let me know down in the comments. Did Elena exact the perfect revenge, or was Matteo's submission the real victory? Share this video with your fellow historical drama fans, and make sure to ring the notification bell to catch our next epic tale of betrayal, power, and redemption. Thanks for watching.